Hey, good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for tuning in this Tuesday morning. I hope you're having a great morning so far, a great start to your day. And I'm excited that you're tuning in to hang out with me for a few minutes as we do a deeper dive into the sermon that we listened to this past Sunday from Pastor Matt. Man, what a huge blessing that was. I'm so glad that he got up and shared just a powerful, impactful message about what suffering means for the Christian life. And so if you missed that, I would encourage you can download our app in the App Store or the Google Play Store. You search for Redemption Lakeland. You can find our app. It's totally free. You can listen to any of our sermons on that app, or you can visit the website, redemptionlakeland.com, and you can look for resources, messages, and you can find the message there. So I'm again, excited to be here with you guys this morning. I know what we're going to talk about is kind of a harder topic, but man, it is so important for us. But before we get started, I wanted to remind you of some exciting things coming up this week. Tomorrow night, go ahead and mark your calendar because in the evening, I believe it's at 7, around 7, I think it's 7, we're going to be doing Worship Wednesdays where we're going to gather here on campus of the church. You can watch from your home with your family and worship with us as we sing. We do that about once per month, and I'm really excited because it's going to be great. And on Sunday, we are kicking off a brand new sermon series called Devoted. And so I'm really excited about that. So yeah, if you missed Sunday, we talked about suffering. And Pastor Matt, again, did an awesome job as we read through Acts chapter 14. We're reading about the missionary journeys of Paul and a man named Barnabas. As they travel about from place to place, they share the good news of the gospel. And they encounter some persecution. And so it says in Acts chapter 14 that Paul was actually stoned for proclaiming the good news of Jesus. He was dragged out of the city, and then he rose up the next day and continued on. And so we learned a lot of principles from that. There's a couple that I really love. One was that there's the cross before the crown, and there's death before the resurrection. That was a really great point by Pastor Matt. And then the second one that we're going to focus on today is how we can have hope by keeping an eternal perspective. And so that's what I want to talk about with you this morning. One thing that has struck me as I go about my life as a Christian, the more time that I spend on this earth, the older I get, I realize that it's not a matter of if we will suffer, but it's a matter of when we will suffer, when we will suffer. There's no question that every human being on this planet is going to go through hard times. We know what the end of our life looks like because there's always an end of our life, right? I mean, we've all been through hard times, we've all been through difficulty, but what can be promised is that you and I will encounter suffering. And I also am encouraged by the fact that the Bible's not shy about that fact. The Bible, from beginning to end, talks about the human experience with no holds barred. We hear time and time again about the difficulties encountered by every human being and how we can expect suffering. But the good news is that the Bible doesn't leave you and me hanging in regards to why we suffer, the different ways we might suffer, and why we suffer. It is for a purpose. As difficult as it may be to understand, our suffering is for a purpose. But one thing that is promised is that you and I will suffer, especially as Christians. If you're a believer watching this, I hate to break it to you, there's going to be a moment in your life where you suffer. In fact, the Bible specifically says that for those who follow Jesus, those who give their whole life to Jesus, those who lay down all that they have for Jesus and follow him as a disciple, we are guaranteed to be persecuted. Jesus himself said this. He said, hey, if you follow me, just know that I am heading to the cross. I'm going to suffer. And if you follow me, no servant is greater than his master. You also will encounter suffering. In the book of Philippians chapter 1, verse 29, it says, for it has been granted to you that for the sake of Christ, you should not only believe in him, but also suffer for his sake. Suffer for his sake. I mean, we see this time and time again, not only in the Old Testament, but particularly in the New Testament, that the believers of Jesus, the followers of Jesus will encounter suffering. Now, we should kind of lay a distinction between what is suffering and what isn't suffering. Right? I mean, you might encounter hard times, but oftentimes the things that you and I encounter are of our own doing. We inflict punishment on ourselves. So suffering doesn't look like, social media bashing you. It doesn't look like a fight or a comment war on a post that you make. That's not what suffering is. Suffering isn't a lack of friends because you're obnoxious. It's just not. Suffering isn't people not wanting to be around you because you lack charity and love and you're abrasive. That's not suffering. Suffering looks more like a diagnosis, an illness, a loved one passing, grief and sorrow. Maybe there's, you're suffering because you lost your job in the middle of the pandemic. Maybe you're having economic hardship. Maybe you've been displaced from your home. I don't know what it looks like in your particular scenario, but suffering looks a lot different than self-inflicted punishment. But what can be promised is that suffering will come. You see, suffering is a result of sin. Suffering is a result of evil in the world. We can look back in the beginning in Genesis and see that human beings introduced this concept of sin, this disobedience, this walking away from God. And so we introduced this pain on ourselves. God said, listen, if you obey me, if you follow my commands, if you do all that I tell you and you just don't eat from this one tree in the garden, you're going to be just fine. We're going to be in perfect communion. And what we did is we introduced sin into the world. We introduced death into the world because we disobeyed. And so all suffering that we have is just a natural consequence of that, introducing this sin into the world. Like I said, every one of us has suffered and every one of us will suffer. I know I'm sitting behind a desk speaking to a camera for you guys who are watching at home, but I also am no stranger of suffering, of affliction, even at my young age. I don't want to compare my story to your own, but let me just kind of share with you some things that I've been with to try to give you some perspective. Whenever I was a kid growing up, I grew up in an awesome family, and so God was very gracious to me. I had a mom and a dad who loved me. I had an older sister and a younger sister, and my parents worked really hard to make sure we had an awesome childhood, a fun childhood. We were dearly loved. But my dad, ever since I was a kid, he had been diagnosed with cancer. He had Hodgkin's lymphoma disease. And so my entire childhood was spent watching him suffer. And he worked long hours and he slaved day after day to provide for our family. And he did all of that while going through chemotherapy and cancer treatments. And so I just witnessed my dad lay down his life for the good of his family. And he did it joyfully because he followed Jesus and he knew what his suffering was producing and where he was going. But we watched that my whole life. And whenever I was 8 years old, we went on a family trip to Tennessee over the 4th of July. And it was an awesome trip. I mean, it was so much fun. We got to explore caverns and caves. We got to go down rivers as a family. And it was just one of the most treasured memories I have. And on the way home, my dad had gotten so sick that we had to stop in Georgia and he was hospitalized. And it was at the end of that trip when I was 8 years old, just before my 9th birthday, that my dad died. My dad passed away. And so as an 8-year-old, not having much context for what death looks like and God's purposes and God's plans for me, man, I began to question a whole lot about who I was, my purpose here on earth, and what life would look like as the only man in my house. I was confused. I was lost as a little kid. I was angry. I was bitter. And so I grew up wondering why my neighbor down the street could play catch with his dad, but my dad was gone. How I don't have a lot of facial hair, but how my friend's dad could teach him how to shave and I had to watch a YouTube video. You know, it didn't seem fair. It didn't seem right to me. So I didn't understand. The issue with that, the issue with me being a kid, the issue with not understanding is that you and we see imperfectly. We have clouded vision. It's like we look into a mirror that is dimly lit. You know, we're squinting. We struggle to understand God's purposes behind our suffering. The Bible's not ashamed of saying that. We look in the book of Job as Job suffered. I mean, it was for a purpose. God was using him to demonstrate his glory and his power and having Job increase his faith in him. But Job, for 40 chapters, is like, God, what are you doing? Why did you do this? I can't understand. And so on this side of heaven, we see very imperfectly behind God's purposes and God's plan in our life. Romans 8:28, it says this. It says, we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good for those who are called according to his purpose. And so what we have is a promise in the Bible that God is working together for all things for the good of those who love him. Again, we can rest on that promise, but on this side of heaven, we don't see with perfect vision why God does all that he does. But what I have found to be true in my own life, based on my own story, my own experiences, is that hindsight truly is 2020. Have you ever heard that phrase? Hindsight is 2020. It basically means that when you look back on your life, the circumstances that happened in the past, we have perfect clarity. We can see why things ended up the way they did. We can say, oh, this decision led me here, and then this decision kept me from doing this thing in my life, and instead it brought me where I am today. Hindsight is 2020. And we can look back on all that has happened and see God working and weaving together this perfect thing. Hindsight is 2020. I really love this illustration that was told to me one time. I'll never lose it. I hope that it helps you whenever you think about this. But it basically, the illustration goes that life is like a tapestry. I wish I had an image to show you right now. But have you ever seen a tapestry, like a woven tapestry? If you haven't, just Google this. The backside of a woven tapestry. Whenever you're weaving a tapestry, there's threads that are going all over the place. I mean, the finished piece is absolutely beautiful. But if you look at the back of a tapestry that's woven, it looks like total chaos. I mean, it looks like the artist was half asleep when he did it. It looks like maybe they haven't slept in weeks. I don't know. It just looks like something I might produce as a 3-year-old, the back of a tapestry, because it's a bunch of different threads all going in a bunch of different angles and directions, and it's tied and it's loops, and there's frays and there's colors. You know, there's red and yellow and all, there's just things mixed everywhere. It doesn't make any sense. But if you flip that tapestry over, it's this beautiful picture. And that is what our life is like here on earth. That is what the Christian experience is like. We see our life, we see dimly what's happening. There's all this chaos happening, and it's hard for us to understand. But if we look back on our life, we can kind of get a clearer picture of what God is weaving together. We can see that He is working all things for good. It's like we catch a glimpse of the other side of the tapestry. In Genesis chapter 50, we read about a character named Joseph. And Joseph had suffered miserably. He was sold into slavery from his brothers who hated him. I mean, he was accused of wrongdoing. He was thrown into prison. This guy really went through a lot of things. And at the end of his life, later on, he encounters his brothers again. He's rescuing them because he has food. His brothers are in a land that is encountering famine, and they come to him. They don't know who he is, and he has food to feed them. And so Joseph, very clearly at the end of his life, he understands that God is working all things together for grand purposes, for the good of those who love him. And he is able to say, look, you meant this for evil. All these things that you did for me, you meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. God was working behind the scenes. God was weaving this tapestry that you and I can't really see. And here's the backside of that tapestry. Here's that beautiful picture that God was weaving together. So I can look back at my life now, all these years later after my dad passed away, and I can know that God is using that still to this day for a grand purpose. As painful as that experience was, as difficult as it was, as much as I wish it could have been done a different way, God is so much smarter than you and me. I mean, He knows what He's doing. I can honestly say that if my dad hadn't passed away, I likely never would have met my wife. I likely never would have went to the school that I went to. I never would have my 2 boys, my 2 sons that I have today. I never would be here at Redemption Church. I mean, my life would look so much different. The impact that I have would be so different. So again, I'm looking back. Hindsight is everything. But I don't want to just say, just get through it. Like, hey, all you have to do is make it through your hard time, and then you'll be able to look back and see why God did what He did. That doesn't give you and me much hope, does it? And so I wanted to rest on what Pastor Matt said on Sunday. I think that was such a good point, to keep an eternal perspective in the midst of our suffering. It's really easy to focus on what's happening right now. It's really easy to even think about what led us to the point of what's happening right now. Again, I don't know what's happening. Maybe you did just lose a loved one. Maybe you're in the midst of job loss and you're just like, I don't know, God, what you are doing. I don't know how I'm going to make it, how our end's going to meet. Maybe you're suffering. Maybe you're going through an addiction. Maybe a loved one is sick or dying. Again, I'm not sure what that looks like. But what I do know is that God is piecing these things together. And if we only focus on what's happening right now, we don't have a lot of hope. You see, the Christian promise rests on hope. That's the difference that we have from the world. The world says, hey, there's no purpose. God, this world is what you make of it, right? But for Christians, you and I who encounter suffering, we have a hope in Jesus. We are meant to keep an eternal perspective because we are headed somewhere, and God has given us guidance and direction and purpose. I wanted to read one more verse for you. It's in 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 14. Paul, he's talking about all of the things that we encounter as Christians, and he's talking about keeping an eternal perspective here. He says, knowing that he who raised the Lord Jesus will raise us also with Jesus and bring us with you into his presence. For it is all for your sake that as grace extends to more and more people, it may increase thanksgiving to the glory of God. So we do not lose heart. Though our outer self is wasting away, our inner self is being renewed day by day. He says, for this light momentary affliction is preparing us for an eternal weight of glory beyond all comparison, as we look not to the things that are seen, but to the things that are unseen. For the things that are seen are transient, but the things that are unseen are eternal. Paul is saying this, what you and I encounter in the day-to-day life, man, we focus so much on that because it's what we can see. But he's pointing us to a greater hope in Jesus. He says, look, he died and he was raised again. And through that resurrection, you and I have resurrection hope. You see, when we pass from death to life, we encounter God face to face. And for those of us who have our hope in Jesus, that will be a glorious reconciling. We will be embraced by the Father. That is the great hope that we have. So Paul is able to say, look, all these things that I've been through, the shipwrecks, the beatings, the stonings like we read on Sunday, all of that I consider as a light, momentary affliction that can't be compared to the hope that we have in Jesus in the days to come. Man, if you are a Christian and you are going through suffering, or if you're not going through suffering, we know that you will go through suffering. Keep your hope fastened to Jesus. Keep your eternal perspective. It's so easy to focus on the now, but let's be like Paul, who focuses on the eternal perspective, the hope that we have in Jesus, the resurrection that is guaranteed in him because God's promises never fail. Would you guys pray with me as we close out today? Father, thank you for this day. Lord, I don't begin to understand what all the people who are watching this video are going through right now. Lord, I just ask that you bring peace and comfort. God, that you would help us to see that you are working all things together for the good of those who love you. Lord, would you help give us an eternal perspective? Help us focus on what you're doing, but God, where we're going and the hope that we have in Jesus. Please lift up the eyes of those who are watching. Encourage them in faith to trust in you because, God, your promises never fail. We love you, and it's in your name we pray. Amen. Thank you guys so much for joining us. We love you. I hope you have a great week. And don't forget to tune in tomorrow night as we have Worship Wednesday. I'll see you then.